Hello, everyone, and welcome to another SEJ webinar. Today, we're going to be joined by Mark Munroe, CEO of SEORadar, who's going to be talking about the benefits of QA testing for SEO. I really think you're going to enjoy this presentation. If you're wondering who I am, I'm Brent Satoris, and I'll be moderating today. And Mark, if you want to take a moment, you just want to introduce a little bit about yourself before we jump into some webinar housekeeping points?
Certainly. Yeah, so my name is Mark Munroe. I am the founder and CEO of SEORadar. This is my first webinar. I'm really excited about doing this one. I've been doing SEO for a long time, 15 plus years experience, mostly focused on technical SEO, large dynamic enterprise level site, often with millions of pages. The last company I worked for when I was in-house was Trulia, 100 million plus pages indexed, and a lot of other large dynamic sites over the years, and a lot of focus also on international SEO. I launched SEORadar in 2014 to monitor and protect websites against SEO mishaps. Working on sites like that for so many years, I've unfortunately had a bit of experience with those mishaps, and I'll be talking some of the things I've seen today. Also, we've got John Strumman here he's the SEO director for RentPath. I asked John to join us, and RentPath runs Apartment Guide, Rentals.com, Rent.com. So some big sites that I'm sure a lot of people on this call have used over time. And asked John to join us because he's focused very hard on evolving an SEO QA process at RentPath. I'll talk a little bit about how that went, and John will be here to participate in Q&A if you have any specific questions regarding that.
Beautiful. So let me jump into a little bit of housekeeping. If at any time during the webinar you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to ask through the webinar question box, which is in the bottom of your screen, typically to the side where the GoToWebinar functions are. Just feel free to participate however you need to through there. Also, we'll be having a couple polls in the webinar. This will be your opportunity to kind of participate, get involved, tell us a little bit about your thoughts. It is kind of helpful, and we do ask that you please, take a moment to participate. It won't be long. I think there's only 2 polls in here. Ask questions throughout the presentation. We will be tracking those questions, and at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A period where we will ask and answer all of those questions. So during the presentation, you're welcome to ask those questions, or during the Q&A, you can continue to ask those questions. But we ask, if you have a question, go ahead and toss it in there. That way we can have a lot of information to talk about, and hopefully it will help other people as well. We will do our best throughout the webinar to link any resources or tools that are mentioned. If you have any questions or we miss one, please ask and we'll make sure to include it. After the webinar, please stick around for a short survey. It will be less than 5 minutes. It really just asks a couple basic questions, but it does help us to kind of figure out how to improve. It tells me, do I need to talk more? Do I need to talk less? All those type of things. So by all means, please, if you don't have anything going on too pressing, just give us that 5 minutes and fill out that survey. Lastly, the entire webinar will be recorded and made available to you. I believe there's going to be a recap post on the site, typically on Mondays, and I believe there's also an email that goes out to everybody who registered. So without any further ado, let's dive into the discussion around QA testing for SEO. Mark, take it away.
Sure. Okay, so why a focused QA process for SEO? Why? Well, no one is safe from getting hit with an SEO issue. LinkedIn, right? So no one is too big. LinkedIn temporarily got the index from Google just a couple of months ago. Now there's been some speculation on why or how it happened and what they did. There's various things they could have done. I don't know for sure what happened to them. I do know what happened to other sites, and I'll be going through that as well. But the point is, no one is safe from an SEO issue having a dramatic impact of your site. And and you're the one that's responsible for this, right? Whether you're the in-house SEO, whether you're an agency and you're responsible for your clients, you're the guys that are responsible. And why does this happen? Well, SEO is very vulnerable. I'll be talking about the vulnerabilities. There's so many things that can break and that need to be tested. And testing is difficult, and I'll be talking about that as well. And one of the things that's changed from when I first got into SEO is how fast Google is, how fast they crawl and index content and crawl and index any mistake that goes out there. So you really want to stop it from getting out there in the first place. And what I like to say is, SEO is a really, really tough job, and you all know that, especially because we're responsible for things we can't control. We can't control when Google changes their algorithm. We can't control what our competitors do, but we can control some things, and we can certainly control the site that gets deployed to production. And so let's focus on controlling the controllable. And really, what I'd like to see, what we want to see is SEO testing and monitoring at all stages of development, not just when things get pushed to production. Because Google is so fast, that's too late. So what we'd like to see is it get pushed down to staging, catch things in staging and stop those things from getting deployed. Even better, push it down and get developers to test things and understand what they need to test to see and make sure things don't get broken even before they get sent to staging. The earlier things are caught, the less likely there's going to be a problem. Also, the more efficient for your development process as well. And not really a part of my talk today, but you can also push testing down into specs where whoever writes the specs in your company, whether it's product managers, we actually go through them and test the specs and make sure nothing gets coded that's going to cause you a problem. So now it's time for our first poll question.
First poll. This is where you get to jump right in, everyone. So let me go ahead and launch. I'll read it for you. Who in your organization, who gets involved with pre-release QA testing for SEO in your organization? Think about who on your team is involved in the pre-release QA testing. Is it the SEO team? Is it the product manager, the QA team, the engineer, or we don't really test before updating production? Which isn't exactly a wrong answer. You'd be surprised how many people actually do not do any testing before releasing a publication. LinkedIn is actually one of them, apparently. There's quite a few. LinkedIn's a good story, and I'm just gonna, give a couple of seconds more. We've got about half the people voted, so I just want to give everybody a chance to kind of click their vote in. But there's a lot of organizations who make simple mistakes. It happens. The no index tag happens to so many companies. It really is kind of not a surprise. So let me go ahead and share some of the results here real quick. Close, share. So oh, that's weird. Oh, there it goes. So it looks like it's pretty evenly split between not testing, which again is not a surprise, honestly. That's why a lot of people are probably on this call, and the SEO team with a kind of an equal blend, a little bit blend of going into the QA team and so forth, but mostly the SEO team. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And you do bring up a good point. Sometimes people don't test, well, because they're not necessarily integrated with the deploy environment. Things get deployed by surprise. Engineers are deploying things. And also I've had some customers of ours say, we just update too often to test. I don't think that's a great answer, but and that's why we have these problems. So how to get there? How do we get to a safer place? So the first thing I'll talk about is, really a basis for a lot of getting a safe process in place is what I'm calling comparison testing. Being able to compare two versions of your source code, staging versus production, or once you're in production versus previous version. And beyond that, okay, so you have a way to test, but then you also need a comprehensive test set. What are you going to be testing? What's important to you? And then taking it one step higher would be automation. So you know what to do, you know how you want to test, you know what you want to test, but how do we make it better and more efficient? Change monitoring would really be after you go to production to make sure things are safe once they get into production. As good as you test, things will still happen in production that don't happen in any other environment. So you really need to keep an eye on production as well as part of your QA process. And then also talk the importance of having an archive. If you're doing SEO, in other words, a history of changes and a history of your source code for you to go back and look at. If you're doing SEO for a while, you'll know sometimes there's going to be traffic drops and you're going to be wondering why, and you're going to want to take a detailed look into the past to try and figure out what happened. So some changes are sudden and catastrophic. So Brent talked about no index tag. This is a no index tag that showed up on, it was a friend of mine actually. He called me up in a panic on a Friday night and told me, and coincidentally, it was the same day that a Google update went out. So he thought Google update had killed his site, but actually he had killed his site. So they lost half their traffic for about 2 weeks, plus more as they slowly recovered. When they recovered, they actually recovered at a little bit lower rate. So there was actually about 10% lower. There was actually some permanent damage from this problem. This seems like an easy one to catch. Now, one way to how to catch this, well, you can just pull up the source code and look for the Muddy Robots tag and see if there's a no index. Still, you have to browse through code. It's not obvious to you how it happened. So you're browsing through source code and looking for not this, but all the things that could go wrong. Then it's going to be quite painful and introduce risk. So better would be change detection, taking a look at something that would show you exactly what's changed. So you're not just browsing through code, but you can see what's changed and see whether it's something that you anticipated. So if staging had a no index and production had an index, and you're going to deploy that no index, you know you got to do something. So that's where comparison analysis. Now, to make it easier, actually, we built a little free Chrome extension. We actually built it just for this webinar, so you can get it. It's not. We're waiting for it to get accepted in the Chrome store, but you can still download it and use it, and with instructions at that link. What this does is you have 2 pages loaded into your browser. One would be your production, one would be your staging, or any 2 pages you want to compare. You set the user agent, and then you actually will get a structured comparison of the 2 different versions. In this case, staging versus production. So it's very easy, and this is a test I set up on my site. We would see that the title got wiped out. The title on the left is our good, strong title. The title on the right is just our brand, which actually happens to be a common problem we see with a lot of sites. They end up losing their title and just leaving the brand. And we see the H1 got wiped out, and you can scroll through. But anyway, this will give you a quick way to do a comparison before you go to production and easily see if something that's important to you is getting wiped out. Now, other problems, here's another example of a sudden and devastating problem. What you're looking at here is average keyword rankings, and this just happened in a few months ago for this site in April, and this is, I think, their top 500 keywords that get the most traffic. They're long tail keywords. They averaged very close to #1, and they dropped off the chart in a matter of a few days. So they lost all of their non-branded traffic and 95% of their SEO overnight. What they had was a rendering problem. So they were rendering, when Google came to the site, they were rendering nearly blank pages. So all their keywords went away, their traffic got wiped out. So this is a pretty bad one. And just a note on how to catch something like this, it's really important to test as Googlebot. So whenever you can do an explicit test with our Chrome extension, or you could even get a Chrome extension that will let you use your site as Googlebot. So that's the only way to know for sure that what you're seeing is what Google's seeing, because a hidden problem like this can be deadly. Other cases are more subtle. In fact, when I first joined Trulia, they'd been in the midst of a slow decline. They lost about 10 or 15% of their traffic, which for them at that time, I think they were getting many millions of monthly SEO visits, traffic visits, and they said, okay, figure out what's going on. Well, it was really hard for me to figure out what's going on. They had some theories. Their theories were wrong. What it turned out to be was it was a subtle change in the navigation structure. But it was difficult for me to figure it out because there was no history of the pages that I needed to verify to see what they did. So eventually eventually I discovered it, but it would have been so much more, it's so much more easy if I would have had that archive. And in fact, if they had a good QA process, it probably would not have happened in the first place. So if I would have had that, and as an example of just being able to bring up something and see that a link got dropped off the page. And in this case, I demonstrated this with my site, and let's say all of a sudden I'm not getting any traffic to a particular page, my demo page. Well, I could pull this up and say, oh, this got dropped off. The demo link got dropped off. No wonder Google has dropped my rankings or dropped me out of the index. So again, the comparison report makes it really easy for you to see what's changed and what can have an impact for new release or historically going back in time on your site. So it's time for another question, Brent.
Beautiful. Another poll question for everybody. What website changes are you most concerned about? Title changes, H1 changes, content de-optimization, or number 2, meta robots and robots.txt. Number 3, changes to internal linking. Number 4, canonical tags, or number 5, other. And feel free to tell us in the chat if you would like to divulge what your other area is. Again, what website changes are you most concerned about? And we'll give everybody a moment to put theirs in there. What would be mine, I wonder? Probably internal linking. As much as link building needs to go away, as much as link authority is probably at some point going to go away, I think internal linking, in my opinion, would probably be the one thing I would be the most concerned about, messing with authority and then not being able to find it. But I honestly, if it was me, it would be more about like technical SEO speed-based stuff. Anyway, let me hide those now and share the results. Mostly title changes, H1 changes, and content de-optimization with 57%, with the number 3 being the second, changes to internal linking. So I was right there in the second group, followed closely by meta robots and then canonical tags. So there we go. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, did we get any other ones that were interesting?
I didn't see anything come through in the chat, but I will I'll mention.
Well, I covered the big ones then, but it's interesting. Internal linking is actually pretty dramatic and also one of the more dangerous ones because it's not obvious. Imagine that's what happened to Trulio, or imagine something as simple as you have an HTML sitemap in your footer and that gets deleted. Well, that's going to be really painful and not obvious.
Yeah.
And there are some other ones. So I tried to categorize them as critical, almost critical, and really important. I don't like low, high, medium, and low because no one pays attention to anything that's not high. All these things are important and can cause problems for you. On critical, I've got the nav and meta robots, no index, no follow, and canonicals and titles. Redirects is one that's interesting that can really, really mess you up, especially if you have historical redirects that bring you link equity and they break after the fact. That happened to me at a startup I was with. An engineer decided to take down the links because we'd done the re-architecture like 6 months earlier and he figured we didn't need it anymore, and we got hit really bad. And href lying, if you have international sites, is really important. Making sure content areas don't drop off. And so all these things are really important. What you have to do is figure out what's important to you. I mean, even H2s might be important to you if you've decided to heavily optimize those. So you need to figure out what's important to you. And I've actually created a matrix, or if you don't have one already, that lists out the items to be tested, and then you cross-reference that with the pages you want to test, and you have something that you could turn over to your QA team or use yourself to say, let's test and make sure none of these things changed. So you could pick that up. All right, so let's say we know the things that are critical and need to be tested, but we also need to know what we have to test. And if you have a dynamic site, like an e-commerce site, or a travel site, or a apartment rental site, a real estate site, then you're going to be template based. You're going to have a set of templates that need to be tested, and you want to make sure they all get tested. So if it's e-commerce, then it's products and categories and brands and sales and perhaps blog, and you want to test a certain sample. But depending on how manual or automated you are, if you're automated, you can test more. If it's a real estate site, then it would be cities and houses for rent in cities, or condos for rent in cities, and the actual listing itself. So you need to figure out those unique templates, but then you also have custom content. So these are you're probably not going to test if you have a really large site. There are some that are really important to you, and these are pages that are custom created and might be getting updated and optimized. So just testing the template wouldn't catch changes to these. So that would be the home pages, corporate pages, blog posts that are important to you, HTML sitemaps, as we talked about. Not only do you need to link to them, you need to make sure they don't break. That was kind of the issue that we had with Trulia. We linked to it, but then there was a bug in creating those sitemaps that were missing links, product info pages. So you need to find the pages to be tested. You can add those in to a matrix if you're using that test matrix. And then one tip is also don't forget to test pages that you specifically do not want to get indexed. So pages with no index or canonical tags pointing elsewhere. So that's kind of an easy to miss problem that could be a big problem, where you'd let lots of low quality content get into Google's index, eat up some of your crawl budget for pages that you don't even want to be in an index. Example with that would be, for instance, e-commerce product pages might have variations that have color or size, and those often are going to be no indexed. Sites that have search result pages or faceted search, often those variations can create millions of pages that you don't want to index as well. You can also block these with robots.text besides no index or canonical tags, but you want to make sure they don't get indexed. Okay. So now what? Let's say you've got your templates, you've got your key content pages, you've got the elements that are important to you, but it's pretty massive, right? This is a big deal. There's lots of stuff to test. So you can explain, why lots of people don't test. There are so many things to test and so many things to break. With frequent releases, it's difficult, even if you have a decent methodical, semi-manual, we'll call it, process where you have a matrix, you have the things you're going to test, it's comprehensive, but it's still time-consuming and it's still pretty manual. And suppose, let's say you have a site, a fairly large site with lots of templates, like the one we looked at, and buried in there somewhere, there's a canonical tag missing on one particular template, there's a no index tag on another template, there's a title tag that's getting modified on a key landing page, and you've lost your footer link to your HTML sitemap. But you don't know this has happened. It's buried in your massive pages somewhere. Really, it's going to be really hard to find. It's kind of like a needle in a haystack. That's where a change management solution can really help you. Something that highlights all the changes that you identify as critical to you and provide a permanent record. And then the archive and screenshots as part of this solution, so you have something to go back and look to see what happened in the past. So you're not doing SEO blind. And then being able to test, part of it is test, not just monitor production, but also test on staging. So I'll talk a little bit, I mentioned John Stroman here is from RentPath, and this is kind of how they've evolved with their SEO process. They went from a manual process to a screaming frog, where they started using screaming frog for their testing. Let me talk about that a little bit on how that worked. So what they would do with screaming frog, and hopefully I got this exactly right, John, or very close, is would crawl staging and export that to a spreadsheet. They'd crawl production and export that to a spreadsheet. They merged the spreadsheets, and they had some macros which would highlight the changes and generate a final report. So this worked, but it was very thorough, but time consuming. I think I heard the macros were a little iffy, and And if you're in a release process, think about this, you know, you're test staging, you find some bugs, then you got to go back to dev, then they got to do a new release, then you need to do this, go through this process all over again. So it worked, but it was pretty cumbersome. So at that point, they went over to start using SEORadar. They replaced Screaming Frog with a process where really they could do that whole thing with a single click. Automatically crawl staging, automatically crawl production, run the comparison, and generate the comparison, the differences. And that way, they can get a single report of all the changes in this particular version of the code that's about to go live, and see what needs to be fixed, if anything. And I'll just zoom in a little bit. This is not their site, this is my site, and I kind of hacked this up so we have things to look at. But in this case, you look and you say, oh, we have one H1 tag change. Let me look at that. We lost 6 titles on staging. That's not good. We don't want that to happen. Notice we have you can prioritize them as well. We lost some navigation links that used to be there. Why are navigation links going away? So this would give you the ability to drill in and just look at the pages with the issues and just look at the specific changes that happened to those pages. So for instance, you could drill in and see, okay, on this page, the title changed from a good SEO title to just a brand. If we needed to, we could email this over to a dev to work on the problem. We could update the status. Or if it was something that was planned, you could just keep note of it and analyze it in the future. You know, we know that we're going to change this. We'll log this and keep a record of it so we can see the impact of it in the future. And then if you want to, you can still go in and drill even further down and look at the source code, either the structured SEO element view or full HTML view or just the content. So you got this source code compare as well. And you also might want to look at what happened to the screenshot, so you can pull that up as well. So we've got this kind of easy way to see everything that happened before you push the button and deploy to production, or monitor production after you go to production. And then as far as RentPath's evolution beyond this is, remember I had that slide earlier about pushing things down into dev, and what they want to do is integrate into the dev process. So we're trying to figure out how to do that together. It does put some specific requirements on us, and it looks like we should be able to get that in place for RentPath maybe in the next month or so. And Q&A.
Sweet. You know, I really think that, you know, testing is just always one of those things that I don't think people, especially like tracking all the changes, I don't think people really appreciate until you have an error, until you have an issue, and then, you know, you're trying to find what happened in the last year and a half, you know, and who made what changes and why did this happen and what was the actual change. And it can be a little bit like a needle in a haystack. So I definitely think this is one of those areas that, you know, people, and I'm happy to see a lot of people are on the call kind of looking to solve, you know, and get help with, because it really is an area that it's so painful after the fact that you typically won't have the same problem happen twice, because people really turn around and start tracking a lot more. We do have quite a few questions coming in. Just want to continue to invite anybody else who has questions to keep, you know, throwing them in the chat, and we'll keep getting them out there. I do want to take a quick moment to just mention that we do have a webinar coming in 2 weeks that I want you to know about. It's for SaaS marketing, how to never miss your MQL goal again. It's by Garrett Murgus. I always mess his name up, but I feel like since everybody in the world messes my name up, I get like carte blanche to mess everybody else's up. But Garrett is super, super fun, super smart. So definitely recommend signing up for that webinar. Without any further ado, let's dive into some of the questions. This one's a little bit longer question, so I'm going to kind of go through it a little bit. we're getting our website redesigned and we have the development side marked for no index, right? And to disallow robot paths, right? Normal stuff that you would do when you're doing development. We took the developing site, we took it live, right? And moved it to the server. And we noticed that some pages didn't get indexed. They lost being indexed, or they were de-indexed, or they didn't show up. And we lost some rankings. And 2 days later, we got that back, right? And I think that our general premise in SEO is you typically have anywhere from up to a week of mass fluctuation when you do new launches. But the question here is, what can we do about that to avoid having any loss, or to mitigate that loss as much as possible?
So this so what did the
All
no
the
index
URLs were
tag,
the same. All the URLs were the same. It was just a redesign.
did the no index tag actually get pushed?
No, because they said, I mean, it wouldn't have been, because then it would have de-indexed the whole site, right? I don't have that information, but I'm going to
This is
assume no.
So this is just kind of so this is a general question. I would do try and if you can minimize changes at all. It's just a redesign, but just a redesign can mean a lot of things, right? If you can minimize navigation changes, because that can have a big deal. Also, redesign can also, your titles in H1 might be the same, but the content is different. And did somehow things get de-optimized? One of the things you can do is you could compare, keyword density between the two versions of the code. Actually, you can do that with our product before you release it. Just do a keyword density comparison, or just a keyword analysis to see how keywords being used on your staging environment, your new environment, and see if somehow you've done something to de-optimize. And that linking structure is always a big deal as well. There's no perfect way to do it, but a detailed change, especially if it's a redesign, a detailed change comparison, whatever method you use, whether it's Screaming Frog or our product, but a detailed change comparison between your staging environment and production before you hit the button. And then anything you see, if you can hold back on some of those changes, then that would be good, because the more things happen, the harder it is to debug.
Also note that even if you do all of these things perfect, anytime you're doing like significant changes to a website, you might see some fluctuation for a couple of days. It's pretty, it's not unheard of, right? But I think those are great ideas to kind of mitigate that risk, because some of these changes can last for months, and you definitely don't want that to happen, right? What end up happening there is you'll end up making a bunch of changes to try to fix it, and then all of a sudden you make more issues, trying to fix some of those.
And I'll add one other thing is also, if there's a technology change, especially introducing more JavaScript and more client-side rendering, then that's something you have to pay close attention to as well, and making sure Google's not having an issue rendering the new content if there's a technology change to client-side rendering, to using JavaScript to render the content.
Awesome. Quick question about the plugin you mentioned, the Chrome plugin. Do you have that in other variations? Does it work on Edge or any other areas, or is that simply a Chrome plugin?
It's just Chrome right now.
And just note, if you're, Chrome is, a free browser, but if you're like, I just don't want to have Chrome, there is a version, kind of a safer version of Chrome called Brave, which is out, which is a really good browser. It's the one I use, and it supports all of the Chrome plugins. I know Chrome can sometimes slow down systems, and people have concerns about it, but Brave is the solution to that. And so a lot of people in the industry are using Brave. So even if you just download that just for the testing, I think it might be, it's worth having, because this is a really good plugin to be able to compare code, right, and see it right away. So I definitely would recommend that.
Yeah, and we just came out with this version, but we can look at coming out with another browser as well. Actually, this sounds like a good option. What's it called? Brave?
Well, Brave is a good Chrome option. It's like it's. Right. I don't want to say it's what you have to have, but it's very popular. But also Edge has really come back strong, right? They've relaunched it. It's the new the Microsoft browser. So Edge is really kind of like Edge. Chrome and you know, obviously, you know, those are kind of two of those, Safari and some of the other ones. But I think Edge is a pretty popular browser.
Yeah, Chrome, I can see the problems with Chrome. I have to kill Chrome like 3 times a day because it eats up all my memory.
So what are some of the, Mark, what are some of you experience a lot of, you know, seeing reports and having these conversations. What do you think are some of the top errors that you see from smaller companies? Like if you were going to look at first question is what do you see from some of the smaller companies? And then also second part of that is what do you see from some of the larger companies as like the higher level, more frequent errors that are made?
Well, from the smaller companies, I mean, if you're using, if they're using, if it's just a WordPress site, then technically things are a little bit simpler, but you can still screw up your site with WordPress, as I have managed to do sometimes, and wipe out your titles. Then I'd say it's more related to individual pages and individual content optimization, and if it's a WordPress site. If it's not a WordPress site, then you still have the same risks of wiping out titles or replicating the same title across the whole site. You still have to be careful of no index tags because WordPress has a way to turn that on, and people are in there. And depending if you're using Yoast or what plugin you're using, on larger sites, dynamic sites, one of the things I'm seeing a lot of issues with lately is rendering issues. So a lot of sites are either doing server-side rendering or dynamic rendering, which is the case with one of the problems that I talked about where they lost all their rankings, and that causes sporadic problems. So 5% of the time the page might not render correctly. That means 5% of the time Google's getting probably a partial template and your keywords are getting lost. That's pretty serious. I am seeing that a lot right now. And it's a little bit of a problem for us because that's not something that you can easily catch in staging. That's more of a live monitoring thing. And for us, our customers usually come to us and think we had a bug because, oh, we looked at the page and it's fine. No, you're randomly having errors. So we're seeing a lot of that. Redirect issues especially with sites that have content that's coming and going away, and canonicalization, we see a lot of that. hreflang, if you have foreign language tags, keeping track of hreflang tags is a big problem. Schemas also, a lot of companies are having issues with schemas where schemas get dropped from a page for no reason and then get reinserted. So some sort of problem with schema. It's pretty much across the board. But one of the big ones I'm seeing lately is rendering issues.
Rendering issues is one that's really interesting because, you know, as people who are really like a scholar of like Google and stuff, you're noticing that Google's trying to phase out its first render crawl, right? They're trying to go to the, you know, the Java rendering engine crawl for all of their crawls, right? And I don't know if they've fully done that yet or if they're ever going to 100% do that, but they're definitely saying all new sites are going through the full rendering crawl, right? And so a lot of times people don't realize that even if you don't have JavaScript, even if you don't really incorporate a lot of JavaScript into your site, you almost always have a little bit somewhere. And the way that new crawler is rendering, there is so many. Bartosz is one that does a lot of presentations showing where entire sections of huge, big Fortune brands are just not indexed at all. So there's a lot happening. If you're technical, it's with the dark DOM overriding the light DOM, and you start seeing a lot of like titles getting changed between pages, a lot of meta getting 2 metas or 3 metas. So you really have to kind of monitor a lot more these days on Java and rendering more than ever.
Right. And actually, talking about comparison testing, a comparison you can do even on a page-by-page basis with the Chrome extension or with our product is compare the rendered version to the fetched version. And that way you can see what's getting inserted with JavaScript, and you could pretty easily test to see if that content's getting indexed.
You mentioned schema being one of the big ones. One of the aspects with schema is that a lot of times, not everybody necessarily agrees with the implementation of schema, right? You have schema.org, you have, you should use JSON or you shouldn't, or you have Google's version, you have, a lot of different people kind of have a different opinion on how schema is validated. And so a lot of times you'll go to Google's schema testing tool and you'll find errors. And you're like, but those are errors that you can't necessarily fix. Should we worry about those errors, or should we just kind of like, accept that it's not gonna be a perfect every time?
I don't have like a perfect answer on that one. I think it's not going to be perfect every time. And Google does report the schema errors, so at least that's something Google does a decent job of reporting. What we're testing is simply we actually do have a schema verification, but we're not that we can turn on for customers. But right now we're just testing to see if schemas get deleted or inserted. So we're kind of testing to see if they go away.
How about testing for ADA compliance? Does any of your tools or any of your systems test for compliance for some of these issues that are coming up? There's ADA compliances, but we're seeing more and more various compliances from around the world that we have to at least pay attention to. Are you incorporating that into any of your tools or have plans to?
We definitely have plans to. It's not there yet, but it's something that we're watching, and I think it will have to be there.
Question here, what's your opinion for expired domains for link building? A little off topic from Q&A testing, but still an interesting question that we'll get your thoughts
on. That's not something I've been it's something I've not been paying attention to much the last couple of years. I have spoken to people who are still doing it and have had it work, but I would, and this is just my opinion, if you're going to do it, it should be very relevant. It shouldn't be dead for a long time. So if you have a travel site and if it's a travel domain, then it's probably okay. But I am not an expert on this, so I would not have a strong
My
opinion on
understanding,
it.
even with that, a lot of times I see people today, you have to go way farther. It's no longer just buy a bunch of expired domains and 301 them. It's like buy domains, maintain the property, go out and find the people who are linking to the pages, ask them to update the link to the new page that they're 301ing to. It's like the thing is, links really need to end up at the final site. And 301s can have value, but you really need the links to get updated, and you need the links to point properly. So there is some aspects that I've heard of it working, just like you mentioned, but not very common.
One of the problems, speaking about links and redirects, that I just saw with a customer who of our product, and I became aware of the problem. I told them about it. Is they had redesigned their site and they dropped. And this is a very prominent site, and they changed their URL structures and got rid of some pages that were their biggest link magnets, and they just 404 them, and that is a big mistake, right? Because they're losing all that historic link equity. They have very relevant pages. These for their top keywords that they could redirect to, and they're somewhat small company, not a tremendous SEO focus, but SEO is really important for them, and certainly I'm having trouble getting them to pay attention to how serious this is, what they did, but they did do this, and it was pretty serious.
Question here, my web team always does testing prior to production. Is this different from SEO testing and staging? And I guess the question is, they're doing some sort of testing, probably that it renders properly, that it's not breaking, that there's the QA testing that you would do from a web dev perspective. Is this different than SEO testing?
I'd say the SEO testing would be just integrating in specific tests that are important for SEO. So I'd say that's the difference. It sounds like they're doing general testing, but they might not be testing to make sure your meta robots tags changed, or your titles got wiped out, or your keywords or your links. I'm getting rid of my footer links because it's ugly, but guess what? You need that for SEO. So I'd say the difference is getting them to put on kind of SEO glasses while they're doing it.
And if you had to choose, provide a little insight on that one too.
Absolutely.
This is John. John from RedPath or whatever. So our team has a full QA team with automation that tests things. But I think the big difference that I've found is like internally we would get like in arguments that would say, no, this is an automation team problem. Like, why didn't you find that we dropped all these links from the page? Like, there should have been a test for that. But the amount of tests needed to really cover the ground, like with SEORadar, is kind of like a catch-all. It's not specific to say, is this module on this page? And some of the things that like I've noticed is what SEORadar can do is scan a whole bunch of pages of the same type, and if it sees a common problem, it starts to raise a red flag. Where with like automation testing, a lot of times the automation engineers will go and test, is this module present on this one individual page? And it could be for that page, but maybe that test isn't thorough enough. And a lot of times stuff will get through the cracks pretty easily. And then SEORadar comes in as like the SEO specific checks. You can still have automation testing, I think, for like, does the product work as it's supposed to, and are these sections of the pages present? But it doesn't really look at things at scale or diff changes. So like if the title's still there, that's great. That's what most automation testing does. But is it the right title? Did it change significantly from version to version?
Great, really good point. Really interesting point, actually. I didn't even think about the fact that you can have, individual pages slated for testing and then not see the common, problem showing up kind of continuously. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah, you do need like a decent sample. So just one of each template is not enough.
Thinking about both of you have experience with href site audit and screaming frogs. The question here is between the two of them for audits, which do you think is stronger?
I'm sorry, between which two?
Screaming frog and hrefs.
Oh, and hrefs. And well, screaming frog is pretty flexible, but you're running it locally. And you got to deal with memory issues, and I'm not as familiar with Ahrefs with their audit.
We've used just to give some. So one thing I think the question is in general, there's like there's other crawlers out there, right? Like there's enterprise level crawlers like DeepCrawl and Botify and things like that, and we use those. We also have local copies of Screaming Frog. But those things, none of those things really solved the problem that we had with that SEORadar kind of fills the gap on. Because you can go run those crawls, but then you're doing the manual comparisons, and they don't have a lot of diff checking from QA to production. It keeps copies of your old sites and things, which is good. And sometimes it'll, you have to do the analysis yourself basically to make sure that. So like I haven't actually used Ahrefs crawler. I'm not sure how well it scales, but there's pluses and minuses to all of those. I don't think any of them do a really good diff check. You can probably dive into the data and find when something broke, but it's usually after the fact.
And I mean, I think we can all agree that like the biggest challenge, we have lots of data, but it's actually being able to use that data is the challenge. And even, I mean, let's put it at a real simple version. Everybody has Google Analytics. Everybody goes in and they check how much traffic they have. Absolutely, almost nobody does anything with any of that data, and that's the big challenge, is to be able to actually take that next step. And I think that's really what you need to be thinking about more is does the platform or tool that you're using facilitate taking a next step? And if not, then you have to find a way to do that or be super dedicated and motivated. Interesting question here. Should I no follow all internal links to a no indexed page?
Should I no follow all internal links to a no index page?
Got a page you don't plan on indexing. Should you no follow the links that are pointed to that no index page?
Let's see. So if you no follow it, I mean, if you no index it, it's going to drop out anyway. I mean, the idea of page rank sculpting was an old thing that people used to do 8, 9, 10 years ago, long time ago, until Google said it doesn't work anymore. So I haven't seen anybody do that. it shouldn't. It may help you with your crawl budget, right? Because then Google's not going to be going there. Something you have to think about a little bit more. But Google is, evenly dividing page rank no matter what among all links. So no follow is not going to affect that anymore. So you're not going to be sculpting, but you're going to be hopefully chopping Google off from wasting some time going to pages that are going to be no indexed and dropped.
And it's still questionable whether they actually don't follow it anyway.
Exactly right.
There's a good chance they. Yeah, I mean, from everything I've seen for the last 5-6 years at least, is that no follow is meant to say I don't know this link, I don't respect this link, I don't want to vouch for this link, and no index is just I don't want you to share this with other people. I don't want you to have it indexed, and so I don't think that that's a thing you have to worry about in today's space.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Can we get, let me see. This is just people trying to guess the LinkedIn problem. They used Google Search Console to temporarily remove the URL for the HTTP version. That's what I heard. I heard that it was a Google Search Console thing, and that's what this individual is putting in as a hypothesis, is that they had both the HTTP and the HTTPS, and they removed the HTTP from Google Search Console, and it dropped the whole site. And then because I know Mueller came out shortly after and made an announcement, and there was some conversations about like, make sure you don't do A, B, or C inside of Google Search Console and so forth. So I do think that is one of the hypotheses that I saw shared.
Yeah, I think that's a good hypothesis. A no index tag might do it, but not overnight. There'd probably still be stuff lingering in the index if it was a no index tag, or even a robots.txt no index. So that's a reasonable hypothesis.
Well, it could be that once they dropped one version, it started reading the other, which had the no index, because they had the no index so that it wouldn't read that version, right? So if they had no index to HTTP and then they had left HTTPS open, but then they wanted to, drop the HTTPS, which I wouldn't imagine they would have done that. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting. I don't know how they would have worked through that, but it's definitely interesting.
There's another site that wiped out. Who was it? They wiped out a large part of their site. In Search Console, and then trying to remember who it was. And they spoke, and they announced it as if it was an experiment, but it wasn't an experiment. They said the experiment was to see how quickly they get re-indexed. And then I went over afterwards. I think he was speaking in SMX. I said, "You were pretty brave to do that experiment." He goes, "It wasn't an experiment."
The Groupon?
Yes, it was Groupon. Right.
Yeah.
It was Groupon. Right.
Question here. Does only optimizing H1 tags and content help in increasing ranking? Like when you really focus on just H1 versus, because we've been experiencing that optimizing the H1 tag and meta tags and alt tag and content does not always help. What do you suggest?
I suggest it's not like it was 10 years ago where you just change a title and you would see your rankings go up. I think Google's taken it's more of a holistic approach to the whole piece of content. So any changes you make should be reflected in the content, because Google's really good now at understanding what a page is about. So if the changes you make sure you also make similar changes throughout the content to reflect your H1s and your titles or whatever else you're changing. Take kind of a holistic approach on the entire page.
And I don't know if it's still an issue as much today, but there was a period of time when Google would look for what they called over-optimized pages, right? Where they would look for people who were like making everything an H1 tag and really, like really kind of doing things that you wouldn't typically do from a developer or from a content structure standpoint. So I think the best practice today is, as Mark mentioned, just kind of like utilizing them as they're supposed to be utilized.
Although I came across an interesting, keywords don't matter these days. It's kind of a very popular refrain. There was one of our customers did a re-architecture and lost a lot of traffic on their key pages, and And a lot of it, believe it or not, had to do with getting rid of keyword repetition, and where they had a lot of repetition. It was, I think, like a jobs page or something like that. And so I think of the word jobs used to be on every ad. I don't remember the exact word, but it was interesting that that getting rid of the repetition was kind of a surprise to me, because I thought, okay, that's not as important anymore in 2020. Now, I'm not sure if it works the other way though. I don't, that was the historic page. I'm not sure if all of a sudden you started focusing on keyword repetition, it would actually help you anymore. But it was a surprise to me. But that's
Another
kind of
question
like
here.
then to be able to compare versions of your code, when you have traffic loss, to say, okay, I lost traffic on these phrases. What changed across the whole page?
For sure. So, QA is great, but let's say, for instance, you believe it's really not that big of a deal. If you make a mistake and index something, sure, you lose a page for a little bit, you can re-add it in, but most of the time you're not going to make a mistake like no indexing. I kind of wanted to throw this off, almost, Mark, you're welcome to comment on it, but I almost wanted to throw it off to John and say, like, you've been, working with SEORadar, and you've been, using a lot of other, solutions. You guys very manual at first, and, went to tools, but still manual analysis. What are some of the things that you've caught that you could mention that would be like, holy crap, if I hadn't caught this would have been a nightmare?
Yeah, I've got a lot of things. So, well, the thing is, we manage 3 sites too. So every time you're releasing for each site once or twice a week, to really do any kind of thorough analysis, like we spent most of our time testing to make sure that everything was okay. And for a while there, so when I first started at RentPath, we had a previous agency had built this Screaming Frog type spreadsheet macro thing, and then that person wasn't with us anymore. So the macro started breaking, so we stopped using the Screaming Frog checks. Now we just weren't doing checks, and I think it was Rent.com. We no indexed the homepage for it was like a month or two, and nobody even caught it until we started wondering why traffic was down year over year on the Rent homepage, and we were like, yeah, didn't catch it. So that's when I rebuilt the Screaming Frog checker, and which basically looked like Mark said, for difference checks, things that we should have flagged, but then so we handed it off to our QA team to say, hey, you guys run the Screaming Frog checks, you guys download the stuff, mash the spreadsheets together, and I built some formulas to do the diff checks. And if there were enough diff checks that didn't pass, then we'd raise a red flag. But each Screaming Frog thing, when you do the downloads, the order of the columns is different, so everything was breaking all the time. And then so that's where we were like, somebody must have solved this problem, and we Googled for diff checker, SEO, QA, and we found this. And just the other day, so we have different site sections, and a lot of times like a dev will change a section of the site potentially, and it breaks other sections. Or last week we had, so one of the things that we have too is we populate the pages with all these microservices. So like one service goes and gets the page title, meta description, and H1. Another service goes and gets it's called the content service. It gets the actual textual content for the sections of the page. We have the listing service, which goes and gets the listings for the search result pages. And just last week, we also have this thing called the SEO metadata service, which basically populates all the links on the page that are the SEO links essentially, and some other fun stuff. But they swapped out they were switching databases, right? So they're pointing the SEO metadata service at a new database. They deployed it, and everybody thought it looked good. We ran SEORadar, and we were getting like intermittent links missing. And what it was that part of the deploy failed. And while everybody thought everything went fine, it looked fine. If you would have checked an individual page, you might have gotten the right server, but it was actually because one of the deploys on one of the servers didn't work, that it was an intermittent problem that would have been really difficult to check. That was one of the most recent things.
Awesome.
But yeah.
Well, we've kind of come to that time where we're out of time, and so I wanted to really thank Mark and also John, you, for joining. I think these examples go a long way, like practical examples go a long way for like really emphasizing kind of like what you need to pay attention to and what you need to do. And again, I think this is one of those things that it's really important to do and set up. And I'm sure people are going to, this is a very personalized thing when you start going into your website and QA testing and stuff like that. So I'm sure everybody listening is going to have some questions or want to continue this conversation. So I encourage all of you to reach out to Mark. You will have access to his information through the recaps and through the emails. And, you know, obviously you can go to SEORadar. Mark, where can people contact you easiest? Like, let's just tell them right now, like, because I know a lot of people are going to have some questions and want to learn more about what you're doing.
mark@SEORadar.com, and I look forward to any questions. Anything to do with solving your SEO issues is all really interesting to me. That's one thing I really enjoy. So any, especially the stranger they are, the better.
And let them know you were watching the SCJ webinar, because he might actually help you out a little bit. You know, you might give you a little extra attention there for having spent the time with him today. And thank you as well, John, for coming on. I know personal, you know, experience is really helpful for this conversation. I appreciate your inputs on some of your experiences. I think that's great and very helpful.
No problem. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, John.
And thank you everybody for joining us and for listening. And hopefully you learned a lot of cool things. I did. I'm definitely going to be checking out this tool a lot more, and hopefully you will as well. And thank you, Mark, for the time again. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Cheers.